The velvet of Camila's blazer was crushed beneath my fingers, a rich, tactile indulgence that felt reckless in a room full of hard surfaces. Across the gallery floor, Vivian stood motionless. Her gaze wasn't just cold, it was a glacial burn that stripped the air from my lungs. I had only reached out to straighten a lapel, a reflex of my trade, but to Vivian, it looked like desertion. She crossed the distance between us with terrifying grace, leaning in until her breath ghosted against my ear. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a confession that terrified us both. But to understand why that moment shattered us, you have to understand the silence we built first. Vivian's gallery wasn't just a space for art. It was a cathedral, dedicated to the absence of noise. The walls were a white so absolute it hurt the eyes. The floors polished concrete that swallowed the sound of footsteps and reflected the cold city light like a frozen lake. Everything here was curated to within an inch of its life, much like Vivian herself. She was a woman of sharp angles and terrifying precision, the kind of person who viewed an untucked shirt or a messy emotion as a personal affront to her world order. I often watched her from my desk, observing the way she moved through the space like a shark in deep water, efficient, lethal, and breathtakingly beautiful in a way that warned you not to touch. I was the head curator, the only variable she allowed to disrupt her carefully calculated orbit. If Vivian was the cold steel structure that held the roof up, I was the warmth that made it habitable. My job was supposed to be about provenance and lighting, about sourcing the right pieces for the right buyers. But in reality, my job was Vivian. We existed in a professional marriage that everyone saw but no one dared to name. I knew she took her coffee black at exactly 8:15 a.m., and she knew I needed 10 minutes of silence after a difficult negotiation. We moved around each other in a synchronized dance, predicting needs before they were spoken, anticipating moods before they fully formed. The intimacy of our days was suffocating. It lived in the scent of sandalwood that clung to her, a dry, expensive smell I breathed in whenever she leaned over my shoulder to inspect a proof. It was in the accidental brush of our arms in narrow corridors, sending electricity through me that I had to pretend to ignore. In the quiet hours, when the HVAC hummed like a mechanical heartbeat against the rain, the hierarchy felt fluid. I would catch her watching me straighten a frame, her focus absolute, dissecting me with the same critical eye she turned on $1 million canvas. It made my skin prickle. It made me want to do something reckless, just to see if she would break. One Tuesday in late October, the air shifted. Vivian called me into her office, the glass box that overlooked the main floor like a panopticon. She didn't look up from her laptop when I entered, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles were white where she gripped her pen. "The winter retrospective," she said, her voice low and clipped. "We're announcing it next week." I froze. The retrospective was the biggest event of the calendar year, a high-stakes showcase that drew collectors from London, New York, and Hong Kong. It was notorious for breaking curators who couldn't handle the pressure. It meant 14-hour days and weekends lost to cataloging. It meant navigating Vivian's inevitable spirals of perfectionism, where she would demand we repaint a wall because the white was too warm by a fraction of a degree. "I thought we were skipping it this year," I said, stepping closer to her desk. "You said the market was too volatile." "I changed my mind," she replied, finally looking up. Her gaze was intense, searching my face for something I couldn't define. "I want this to be perfect. I want it to be definitive, and I need you to execute it with me. No mistakes, no distractions." "I don't make mistakes, Vivian." "I know," she said, and for a second, her voice softened, dropping an octave into something that felt dangerously private. "That's why I need you. You're the only one I trust with this." The admission hung in the air, rare and vulnerable. It was the closest she had ever come to telling me I mattered. But before I could respond, the phone rang, and the moment vanished. She answered it, her voice instantly hardening back into professional armor, leaving me standing there with my heart hammering against my ribs. The retrospective would require perfection, she said, but what she really meant was that it would require total submission to the gallery, to the work, and to her. And God help me, I was ready to give it. If Vivian was the architect of silence, Camila was the inevitable noise that shattered it. She didn't just enter a room, she besieged it, bringing with her a chaotic energy that felt like a humid storm front crashing into a sterile laboratory. She owned the gallery across the district, a space known for avant-garde installations that involved too much neon and, in Vivian's opinion, not enough discipline. Camila was everything Vivian was not: loud, tactile, colorful, and unapologetically messy. She arrived unannounced during a private preview for the retrospective, breezing past the security detail with a laugh that echoed too loudly off the polished concrete floors. The gallery was empty, save for us, the air conditioned to a perfect preservation-grade chill. Camila wore a suit of crushed crimson velvet that looked violently alive against our stark white walls, her dark hair loose and wild, a direct affront to Vivian's severe chignon. I was arranging the lighting for a minimalist sculpture, a single steel rod suspended in space, when I felt her presence before I heard her heels. "God, it's like a mausoleum in here," Camilla announced, her voice rich and smoky, cutting through the carefully curated atmosphere. She didn't look at the art. She looked directly at me. "Don't you get cold, darling, working in a refrigerator?" I turned, clipping my tablet to my side. "It's climate control, Camila. For preservation." "Preservation," she scoffed, stepping into my personal space with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She smelled of heavy jasmine and something sweet, like burnt sugar, a stark, cloying contrast to Vivian's dry sandalwood. "You know, art is supposed to breathe. You're supposed to feel it." She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from my arm, not touching, but close enough that the fine hairs on my skin stood up. "You look pale. You need sun. Or wine. Or a job where you're allowed to make a mess." "I'm working," I said, though my voice lacked the dismissal I intended. Camila had a way of looking at you that made professional boundaries feel like a suggestion rather than a rule. She leaned against the pedestal of the sculpture, a sacrilege that would have given Vivian an aneurysm, and tilted her head. "You're wasted here," she murmured, her eyes dropping to my hands, then back to my lips. "I've seen your curatorial notes. You have fire in you. Why do you let her freeze it out? Come work for me. I'd let you touch the art. I'd let you do whatever you wanted." The implication hung heavy and sweet in the air. It was a job offer, wrapped in a proposition, delivered with a lazy, predatory smile. My heart did a traitorous little skip, not from desire, but from the sheer illicit thrill of being courted right in the center of Vivian's fortress. Then the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I felt it before I saw it, a prickling sensation at the base of my neck, the ancient biological warning that a predator had entered the clearing. I looked up. Vivian stood on the glass-walled mezzanine above us. She was perfectly still, her hands resting on the railing, looking down like a monarch surveying a peasant revolt. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of terrifying neutrality, but her stillness was violent. She wasn't just watching. She was dissecting the distance between Camilla's crimson shoulder and my black blazer. She was calculating the trajectory of Camilla's flirtation and measuring my response in microns. For a long, suffocating moment, she didn't move. She just let her gaze burn us. It was a power play, a reminder of who owned the ceiling, the floor, and the air we were currently wasting. Then, she turned and began to descend the floating staircase. Her heels struck the metal steps with a rhythmic, deliberate cadence. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a countdown. Camila straightened, sensing the shift. She didn't look scared. Camila didn't do scared. But she looked wary, like a cat that realizes it has wandered into a wolf's den. Vivian reached the ground floor and glided toward us. She didn't rush. She moved with the hydraulic smoothness of heavy machinery. She stopped exactly 3 feet from Camila, invading her space by simply existing with more force. "Camila," Vivian said. Her voice was soft, smooth, and sharp enough to shave with. "I wasn't aware we were hosting a circus today." "Vivian," Camila countered, her smile tight. "Always a pleasure. Just admiring the staff. You keep them so well trained." "My staff are professionals," Vivian replied, her eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second, a cold, possessive check, before locking back onto Camila. "They value precision, something you might find difficult to understand, given your gallery's reputation for Clutter. Passion isn't clutter, Viv. Maybe if you loosened that bun, you'd know the difference. Vivian's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a terrifying expression. This is a private viewing, Camila, and you are disturbing the aesthetic. I believe the exit is behind you. Unless you need a map? It was a dismissal so polite and so brutal, it felt like a physical shove. Camila held her ground for a second, her eyes flashing with defiance, but the weight of Vivian's territorial claim was absolute. Fine, Camila said, stepping back. She winked at me, a flash of rebellion. Think about my offer, darling. I promise, I don't bite. Unless you ask. She turned and walked out, her velvet suit a receding wound against the white walls. The door clicked shut, sealing us back in the silence. But the air had changed. It was no longer sterile. It was charged with the static of a threat. And for the first time, I realized that Vivian's control wasn't just about the art. It was about keeping me. It was 2 a.m, a dangerous hour when the structural integrity of professional boundaries begins to degrade under the weight of exhaustion. The gallery was dark, a cavern of shadows and silent shapes, save for the glass-walled office where Vivian and I were suspended in a pool of artificial brightness. We were finalizing the catalog layout for the retrospective, a task that required surgical precision and, apparently, the sacrifice of sleep. The rest of the city had long since surrendered to the night, leaving us marooned on this island of light, the only 2 people in the world who cared about the kerning on a caption for a mid-century abstract. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from the crisp efficiency of the day into something hazier, thicker. The air conditioning had cycled down, leaving the room quiet enough to hear the hum of the light table we were huddled over. Vivian had removed her blazer, a rare concession to human comfort that felt shockingly intimate, like seeing a statue breathe. She wore a silk blouse the color of heavy cream, the sleeves rolled up to reveal wrists that looked deceptively fragile. We were moving slides and proofs across the illuminated surface of the table, our hands weaving in and out of the same small square of light. The exhaustion stripped away our usual defenses, leaving us raw and permeable. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the scent of her expensive, dry perfume and the warmth radiating from her skin. She has no understanding of negative space, Vivian said suddenly, her voice low and rough with fatigue. She didn't look up from the proof she was marking with a red grease pencil. Camila, her gallery is a garage sale with a liquor license. I paused, a slide hovering in my fingers. We hadn't spoken about the intrusion since it happened, but I knew it had been festering behind Vivian's composure. She has a different philosophy, I said, keeping my tone neutral, testing the waters. She believes in immersion. She believes in noise, Vivian corrected, slashing a line through a paragraph of text. She finally looked up, her eyes dark and unreadable in the glow of the table. How long have you known her? You seemed familiar. It was an interrogation disguised as casual conversation. Vivian Marlowe did not make small talk. She collected intelligence. She was building a provenance for my loyalty, tracing the history of ownership to see if there were any liens on my attention she didn't know about. We went to grad school together, I answered, placing the slide down. She was loud then, too. But she has a good eye, Vivian. You can't deny that. I can deny whatever I like, in my own building. She dropped the pencil, the sound sharp against the glass. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, which brought her face level with mine. The distance between us collapsed. She offered you a position. She did. And? The word was a precise, razor-thin challenge. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth, a reckless impulse born of sleep deprivation and the proximity of her mouth. And, I said softly, leaning in just enough to blur the line between colleague and co-conspirator. Are you worried I might take it? Vivian went still, the air between us charged, thick with static. To ask Vivian Marlowe if she was insecure was like asking a lion if it was afraid of a mouse. It was absurd. And yet, there was a flicker in her eyes, a crack in the porcelain. She didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned closer, until I could see the gold flecks in her irises, until I could feel the heat of her body radiating across the inch of space that separated us. I'm not worried about you leaving for a better offer, she whispered, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest. Because there isn't one. I'm worried you might leave for a chaotic one. Some people mistake adrenaline for passion. I know the difference, I murmured. My gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. I saw her breath hitch, a tiny, involuntary fracture in her control. Do you? She challenged, her voice barely audible. Prove it. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. The light table illuminating us from below like ghosts, the tension so high it felt like the glass beneath us might shatter. I realized then that this wasn't about business. It wasn't about the catalog or Camila or the gallery wars. Vivian wasn't afraid of losing a curator. She was terrified of the silence returning to this office when I was gone. She was terrified of being alone in the perfection she had built. And God help me, looking at the terrifying, beautiful need in her eyes, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. The morning arrived with the deceptive calm of a receding tide. The gallery was bathed in a stark, unforgiving daylight that exposed every dust mote, every imperfection. Though in Vivian's world, imperfections were hunted down and eliminated before the doors even unlocked. I was at my desk, buried under a mountain of shipping manifests for the winter retrospective, trying to ignore the lingering electricity from our late-night session. The air between us was still vibrating, a low-frequency hum that made it difficult to focus on insurance valuations. I caught myself watching the glass walls of her office, waiting for a signal, for an acknowledgement of the intimacy we had almost breached. Instead, the universe sent a courier. He was a disruption, a young man in a windbreaker, bringing the chaotic scent of the street into our hermetically sealed sanctuary. He carried a package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with actual twine, a tactile, rustic object that looked violently out of place against the sleek white lacquer of the reception desk. I reached for it, but Vivian was faster. She materialized from the shadows of the archive room, her movements sharp and predatory. She signed for the delivery with a slash of her pen, her eyes never leaving the package. She didn't hand it to me. She inspected it, turning it over in her hands like she was checking for a ticking mechanism. She walked over to my desk and placed it down. She didn't drop it, but the placement was heavy, deliberate, a thud that echoed with disproportionate violence in the silent room. "It seems you have admirers," Vivian said. Her voice was ice over deep water. I looked at the package. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the card was unmistakable. Looping, expansive, chaotic. Camila. I slipped the card out. "Thought you needed something real to touch. First edition. Don't let the frostbite get you." Inside the paper was a book, a rare first edition monograph of 1920s Parisian avant-garde photography we had briefly debated during her intrusion. It smelled of old paper, vanilla, and the faint, cloying trace of Camilla's jasmine perfume. It was a thoughtful gift. It was a declaration of war. "In my office," Vivian commanded. She didn't wait for me to stand. She turned on her heel, the silk of her blouse rippling with the tension in her spine. I left the book on the desk, unopened, and followed her into the glass box. This wasn't a meeting. It was an arraignment. Vivian stood behind her desk, putting the barrier of heavy glass and steel between us. She didn't sit. She picked up her fountain pen, a black Mont Blanc that usually looked like an extension of her fingers, but today she gripped it like a weapon she was afraid to drop. "We need to discuss security protocols regarding external correspondence," she began. Her tone was professional, bureaucratic, but the cadence was too fast. "It is a liability to have unvetted packages delivered directly to the curatorial staff. We deal with high-value assets. We cannot afford distractions." "It's a book, Vivian," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. "Not a bomb. It is an unsolicited gesture from a direct competitor who has openly expressed an interest in poaching my staff," she snapped, her composure fracturing. She looked at me then, her gaze raking over my face with a mix of fury and something far more desperate. "She is trying to buy your attention. Is it working? Is that all it takes? A dusty book and a cheap compliment about your fire?" "You were listening," I noted, stepping closer to the desk. "I hear everything in this building. I own the acoustics." "She's just playing games, Vivian." "I don't like games. I like loyalty. I like precision." She looked down at her hands. The pen was trembling. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny tremor in her thumb, but for a woman who could sign a $10 million acquisition without blinking, it was a seismic event. She wasn't angry about the corporate espionage. She was terrified. She looked at the book through the glass wall, then back at me, her eyes wet and furious. "She thinks she knows your taste," Vivian whispered, the accusation raw. "She thinks she can walk in here and understand what you need better than I do." I watched her unravel, and a dark, heavy heat coiled in my stomach. Seeing the untouchable Vivian Marlowe undone by jealousy was a heady, dangerous rush. It gave me a sudden, terrifying realization of my own power. She wasn't just my boss. She was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified I was going to let her fall. "She doesn't know me," I said softly, holding her gaze until she stopped breathing. "She just knows what she wants. There's a difference." Vivian swallowed hard, the line of her throat working. She set the pen down, forcing her hand to be still. "Leave the book," she said, her voice barely audible, "and get back to work. We have a retrospective to hang." I left the office, the scent of betrayal, jasmine and fear, lingering in the air. The book stayed on my desk, unopened, a monument to the line we had just drawn in the sand. The day of the winter retrospective arrived, not with a bang, but with the high-pitched whine of a drill and the frantic shouting of the catering staff. The gallery ceased to be a place of worship and became a war zone. The silence we had so carefully cultivated was shattered by the chaotic symphony of event production. Caterers clashed with lighting technicians over floor space, florists hauled in architectural arrangements of white orchids that looked more like weapons than flowers, and the air was thick with the smell of industrial cleaner and expensive hors d'oeuvres. It was a desecration of Vivian's temple, and she was vibrating with a frequency of stress that threatened to shatter glass. I watched her from across the main floor as she decimated a lighting director. She was gesturing at a spotlight focused on a Rothko, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "It's too warm," she hissed, her hands slicing the air. "I asked for 5,000 Kelvin. This is yellow. It makes the canvas look like it's rotting. Fix it or get out." The technician looked ready to cry. Vivian didn't care. She turned on her heel, her eyes scanning the room for the next imperfection, the next flaw in her controlled universe. When her gaze landed on me, for a fraction of a second, the fury wavered. She looked exhausted, a woman holding up the sky with trembling arms. Then the mask slammed back down, and she stormed toward the private executive suite at the back of the gallery. I gave the lighting director a sympathetic nod. He was right. The light was fine, but that wasn't the point, and followed her. This was part of the dance. When Vivian reached her breaking point, I was the only one allowed to witness the collapse. The executive suite was a sanctuary of soundproofed quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony outside. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the prep crew. Vivian was standing in the center of the dressing room, surrounded by mirrors. She had shed her armor of the tailored suit and was standing in a gown of midnight blue silk that pooled around her feet like spilled ink. It was a dress designed to intimidate, structured, backless, and severe. But right now, she wasn't intimidating. She was struggling. Her hands were reaching behind her back, fingers fumbling blindly with a delicate clasp at the nape of her neck. Her knuckles were white, her movements jerky and frustrated. She let out a sound of pure, unadulterated aggravation, a sharp exhale that was almost a growl. "Vivian," I said softly, announcing my presence so I wouldn't startle her. She froze, her hands dropping to her sides. She didn't turn around. She stared at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her eyes dark and guarded. "It's stuck," she said, her voice tight. "The hook. It won't catch. Let me." I crossed the room. The carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps, making the approach feel predatory, or perhaps inevitable. I stopped directly behind her. The proximity was dizzying. Up close, the scent of her was overwhelming. The dry sandalwood, the sharp chemical tang of hairspray, and beneath it all, the warm, biological reality of her skin. She was radiating heat. For all her icy exterior, Vivian Marlowe burned hot. I reached out, my fingers brushing the bare skin between her shoulder blades. She flinched, a microscopic reaction, but she didn't pull away. Her skin was incredibly soft, a shocking contrast to the hard angles of her personality. I found the clasp, a tiny, intricate piece of metal that required patience, not force. "You're tense," I murmured, my hands working the mechanism. I could feel the muscles in her shoulders bunched tight as steel cables. "I'm surrounded by incompetence," she replied, though the bite was gone from her voice. She was staring at me in the mirror, watching my hands on her body with a focus that felt heavy, tangible. "The lighting is fine, Viv. The flowers are perfect. The art is safe." I got the hook to catch, then moved to the zipper that ran down the length of her spine. "You're just afraid it won't be enough." "It has to be enough," she whispered. I slowly pulled the zipper up. The sound was a soft zzz that seemed deafening in the quiet room. As the silk tightened around her waist, she exhaled, a long, shaky breath that seemed to empty her lungs. I didn't step back when the task was done. I stayed there, standing in her personal space, my hands hovering just inches from her waist. "You need to breathe," I told her reflection. Vivian closed her eyes. For one terrifying, beautiful second, she leaned back, just an inch. Just enough that her weight rested against me, her head tilting back toward my shoulder. It was a surrender. It was an admission that she couldn't hold herself up anymore. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart against my chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. The air in the room charged, thickening with everything we weren't saying. If I moved my hands an inch, I would be holding her. If she turned around, we would be face to face, lips inches apart. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating. I watched her face in the mirror. The vulnerability there was so raw it felt like a violation to look, and yet I couldn't look away. She opened her eyes, our gazes locked in the glass, dark on dark, fear on fear. "Don't," she whispered. I didn't know if she was telling me not to stop or not to start. Then the spell broke. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. "Ms. Marlowe, the donors are arriving." Vivian straightened instantly, pulling away from me as if I had burned her. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the steel spine and the cold gaze. She smoothed the silk over her hips, checking her reflection for flaws, finding none. "We have a show to run," she said, her voice cool and detached, as if she hadn't just been leaning into my arms. She walked to the door, her hand on the knob. She paused, looking back at me one last time. "Fix your lipstick," she said. It smudged. She walked out into the noise, leaving me alone in the silence, breathless and shaking. The transition from the suffocating intimacy of the dressing room to the main floor was physically jarring, like stepping out of a decompression chamber into a gale force wind. The gallery, usually a cathedral of silence, had been desecrated by the roar of 300 wealthy voices. It was a sea of black tuxedos and architectural gowns, a moving tide of high society sharks circling the art with wine glasses in hand. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, ozone, and the metallic tang of money changing hands. I moved through the crowd with a practiced fluidity, my smile fixed in place like a piece of jewelry. I was the head curator now. The woman who had almost touched Vivian's skin in the dark was gone, buried under layers of professional charm and a fresh coat of lipstick. I played my part perfectly. I laughed at the bad jokes of oil tycoons, nodded solemnly at the critiques of women who bought art to match their sofas, and steered the conversation away from price tags and toward cultural significance. But beneath the surface, my nerves were stripped raw. I could feel Vivian's presence in the room like a gravitational anomaly. She was on the far side of the gallery, holding court with the museum board, her spine steel straight, her face a mask of regal disinterest. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. We were tethered by the secret of what had almost happened, a silent frequency that hummed beneath the noise of the party. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a subtle change. It was a rupture. The heavy glass doors at the front of the gallery swung open, and Camila made her entrance. She was late, of course. Calculatedly, fashionably late. And she was a riot of color in a room committed to monochrome chic. She wore a suit of emerald silk that shimmered under the gallery lights, the fabric fluid and unstructured, moving with her like liquid. It was a violent clash against the stark white walls and the sea of black tie, a visual scream that demanded attention. She didn't pause to check her coat. She simply strode into the center of the room, her laughter cutting through the polite murmur of the crowd like a knife through silk. The oxygen in the room seemed to rush toward her, leaving the rest of us breathless. She didn't look at the art. She didn't look at the donors. She scanned the room with the predatory confidence of a tiger entering a petting zoo. And her eyes locked instantly on me. I was standing near the champagne tower, a precarious pyramid of crystal that reflected the fractured light of the room. I tried to turn away, to bury myself in a conversation with a collector from Zurich, but it was too late. Camila cut a path through the crowd, ignoring the glares of the patrons she brushed past. She arrived in my personal space with the force of a collision, smelling of jasmine and trouble. "You look like you're attending a funeral, darling," she purred, her voice low and rich, sliding under the noise of the party. She leaned against the table, holding the champagne, her posture loose and relaxed, a direct insult to the rigid posture of everyone else in the room. Is the art dead, or just the conversation? "It's a retrospective, Camila," I said, keeping my voice level, though my pulse hammered a traitorous rhythm. "We're honoring the past." "You're burying the living," she countered, reaching out to pluck a glass from the tower with a terrifying lack of caution. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving my face. They were dark, amused, and full of a dangerous heat. "You look beautiful, by the way. Severe, but beautiful. Like a diamond wrapped in black velvet. It's a shame no one here is allowed to touch." "I'm working. Are you?" She stepped closer, invading the invisible buffer zone that professional etiquette demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're suffocating. I can see it in your neck, that little vein right there." She gestured with her glass, the rim dangerously close to my collarbone. "It's fluttering. You're bored, aren't you? You're bored of the silence. You're bored of the rules." "I like the rules. They keep things from breaking." "Things are meant to break," she whispered, leaning in until I could feel the warmth of her breath. "Come work for me. I'm serious. I'll pay you double what the Ice Queen pays you. I'll give you a corner office with windows that actually open, and I won't make you wear the suit. We could make a mess together. Real art, real passion. No heavy silence, just noise." It was a seduction, plain and simple. Not just of me, but of my professional soul. And she knew exactly what she was doing. She was offering me chaos in a bottle, shaking it up and daring me to pull the cork. I smiled at her, a polite, dismissive smile that didn't quite hide the thrill of the game. It was a dangerous expression, one that acknowledged the offer without accepting it. And then I felt it. A burn. A physical sensation of heat on the side of my face. I didn't need to look to know what it was. Across the room, 30 feet away, Vivian had stopped speaking. She was standing in a circle of the city's most powerful collectors, people who could buy and sell her gallery 10 times over, and she was ignoring them all. Her gaze was fixed on us. It was a laser-focused, terrifying stare that cut through the crowd, through the noise, through the distance. She wasn't looking at Camila. She was looking at me. She was watching the way Camila leaned into my space. She was watching my smile. She was watching the proximity. It was a gaze of absolute, terrifying possession. It said, "You are mine." It said, "Step away." But I didn't step away. The alcohol, the adrenaline, the lingering frustration of the dressing room, it made me reckless. I held Vivian's gaze for a split second, letting her see me in the orbit of another sun, letting her feel the thread of gravity pulling me away. Then I turned back to Camila, my smile widening, my body language softening into something that looked, from a distance, dangerously like intimacy. "Double the salary?" I asked, my voice light, teasing. "You must be desperate." "Hungry," Camila corrected, her eyes dropping to my mouth. She shifted her weight, her hip bumping the table, causing the champagne tower to tremble. "There's a difference." She laughed, throwing her head back, and in the movement, she shifted her stance. The lapel of her emerald jacket caught on her arm, flipping upward, exposing the lining. It was a tiny imperfection, a visual flaw in a perfect image. And just like that, the trap was set. It was a flaw in the architecture of the moment, a visual glitch that my curator's brain simply could not ignore. The lapel of Camila's emerald silk jacket had flipped upward near the collar, exposing the pale, matte lining against the shimmering grain of the exterior. It was a trivial imperfection, the kind of thing a normal person would overlook in the haze of champagne and flirtation. But I wasn't a normal person. I was a creature of Vivian's making, trained to spot a millimeter of misalignment in a frame from across a room. The disorder of it itched at my fingertips. It screamed to be corrected. It was a reflex, entirely devoid of romance, born of a desperate need to restore order to a world that felt increasingly volatile. "Hold still," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could check them against the danger of the situation. I reached out. My hand moved through the charged space between us, breaking the invisible barrier of professional distance. My fingers found the silk. It was cool and slippery, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from Camila's skin. I smoothed the fabric down, my thumb brushing against the hollow of her throat, my knuckles grazing the sensitive cord of muscle along her neck. It was a corrective gesture, clinical and precise, but in the low, ambient light of the gallery, with the champagne glass tilting in Camila's hand and her dark eyes locked on mine, it didn't look clinical. It looked like a caress. It looked like familiarity. It looked like I was accepting the offer she hadn't just made about the job. Camila went still. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, tilting her head slightly so her cheek almost brushed my wrist. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips, a predator realizing the gate had been left unlatched. "Careful, darling," she whispered, the sound vibrating in the air between us. "People might think you're enjoying yourself. We can't have that." The air in the room didn't just shift then. It evaporated. I felt the vacuum before I saw the cause. The hair on my arm stood up, a primal reaction to a sudden, catastrophic drop in pressure. I pulled my hand back as if the silk had suddenly turned into a live wire, my breath catching in a throat that had gone instantly dry. I looked past Camila's shoulder, seeking the source of the disturbance. Vivian was moving. She wasn't walking. Walking implies a casual engagement with gravity. Vivian was cutting through the room like a blade through water. She had abandoned her circle of billionaires mid-sentence, leaving them staring at her retreating back. She moved with a terrifying fluid grace, her midnight blue gown flowing around her like storm water. The crowd, sensing the sheer kinetic force of her approach, parted instinctively. She didn't look at them. She didn't apologize. Her gaze was fixed on a singular point in the universe, the space where my hand had just touched Camila's neck. It was a tactical advance. Silent, lethal, inevitable. "Oh, hello," Camila said, sensing the shift in my focus. She turned, following my gaze, and her smile tightened at the edges. "Here comes the weather." Vivian arrived in our space not with a collision, but with a sudden, suffocating stillness. She stopped inches from us, close enough that I could smell the ozone of her fury beneath the sandalwood. Her face was a mask of terrifying neutrality, smooth and cold as marble. But her eyes were burning. They flickered from Camila's face to the emerald jacket, then to my hand, which was now clenched at my side. It was an autopsy of the moment. She was dissecting the betrayal, cataloging the proximity, measuring the distance between our bodies. "Camila," Vivian said. Her voice was low, a velvet-wrapped razor. "I wasn't aware you were in need of assistance with your wardrobe. Perhaps if you invested in tailoring rather than theatrics, the fabric would hold its own structure." "Vivian," Camila countered, though her voice lacked its usual bounce. She swirled her wine, feigning nonchalance. "Your curator has a hands-on approach. I was just complimenting her technique." "Her technique is reserved for art," Vivian replied, the words firing like a silenced pistol. "For things that have value, permanence, authenticity." She took a step closer, invading the space so thoroughly that Camila actually took a half step back. "I believe your glass is empty, Camila, and I believe your presence here has become redundant." It was a dismissal so absolute, it left no room for rebuttal. Vivian turned her back on her rival before Camila could even open her mouth, effectively erasing her from existence. Vivian's focus snapped to me. The transition was jarring, from cold dismissal to blazing, terrifying intensity. She didn't speak. She reached out. Her hand closed around my elbow. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was firm, electric, and undeniably possessive. Her fingers dug into the fabric of my blazer, 5 points of pressure that felt like a brand. The heat of her grip seared through the layers of wool and silk, grounding me, claiming me. It was the first time she had touched me in public, and the shock of it nearly buckled my knees. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling with a frequency only I could hear, "are coming with me." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and steered me away, her grip unyielding. We moved through the crowd, 2 dark shapes blurring past the tuxedoed guests. Vivian was walking fast, her stride long and purposeful, dragging me into her wake. We weren't heading for the exit. We were heading deeper into the shadows, toward the architectural columns that lined the far wall, a blind spot in the panopticon, a place where the silence could finally scream. Vivian pulled me into the architectural shadow of a massive load-bearing column. It was a sliver of privacy carved out of the public spectacle, a narrow alcove hidden from the eyes of the board members and the champagne-sipping vultures. The moment we crossed the threshold into the dark, the professional facade didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She released my arm, but she didn't step back. Instead, she pressed me backward until my shoulder blades hit the cool, unforgiving plaster of the wall. It was a trap, constructed of shadows and silk and the terrifying, beautiful force of her desperation. She was breathing hard, her eyes stripped of their usual icy composure. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't looking at Vivian Marlowe, the gallery owner. I was looking at a woman watching her world burn down. "Is that what you want?" she demanded, slamming her hand against the wall next to my head. "Chaos? Noise? Is the silence here too loud for you?" "Vivian, stop," I said, my voice trembling. I was straightening a jacket. It was a reflex. "It was a choice!" She moved closer, invading the last inches of space I had left. Her knee brushed against my thigh. "I saw you touch her skin. I saw you smile at her in a way you haven't smiled at me in months. Do you think I'm blind?" "I wasn't smiling at her," I argued weakly. "I was smiling at the game." "The game?" she laughed, a broken sound. "She wants to take you. She wants to strip this place bare, and she's starting with you because she knows you're the only thing here that actually matters." Vivian froze, realizing what she had just said. Her hand against the wall was trembling, the vibrations traveling through the plaster into my shoulder. "Vivian," I whispered, reaching out to touch the hand that wasn't pinning me to the wall. "No." She pulled back, but only an inch. She leaned in, her forehead resting against the wall next to my ear, her face turned toward me so that our lips were aligned, separated only by a breath of charged air. She closed her eyes, fighting a battle I couldn't see. "I can't do this without you," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't run this place alone. I can't walk into that office every morning and see your empty desk. I can't handle the silence if you're not there to break it." It wasn't about the gallery. It wasn't about business or competition or the retrospective. It was about the terrifying, hollow ache of solitude. It was about the fact that for 3 years we had been living in a marriage of minds, and the threat of divorce was tearing her apart. She opened her eyes. They were wet, shimmering with unshed tears that made the dark irises look like obsidian underwater. She looked at me with a vulnerability that was devastating. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered. The words were raw, a terrified confession scraped from the bottom of her soul. It wasn't a command from a boss. It was a plea from a lover who hadn't yet realized she was in love. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth. I saw the fear that lived behind the perfectionism. I saw the lonely woman who built a fortress of silence because she was afraid of being hurt by the noise. And I saw that I was the only person she had ever let inside the walls. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady, anchoring her. I brought my hand up to her face, my thumb brushing the high, sharp line of her cheekbone. This time, she didn't flinch. She leaned into my palm, closing her eyes and letting out a shuddering breath. "I'm not taking the job, Vivian. I never was. I don't want chaos. I want this." "You promise?" she breathed, turning her face to press a kiss into the center of my palm. A gesture so intimate, so submissive, it nearly stopped my heart. "I promise." For a moment, the world narrowed down to the heat of her skin and the frantic beat of our hearts. We were on the precipice of something irreversible. Then, a sharp digital chime rang out through the gallery speakers. Ding, ding, ding. The sound of the microphone being tested. The call for speeches. Vivian jerked back as if she'd been shot. The spell shattered. The professional mask slammed back into place, though it was crooked now, fragile. She took a step back, smoothing her dress, checking her face in the reflection of the glass column. She was putting the armor back on, piece by piece, but I could still see the cracks. "The toast," she said, her voice raspy. She cleared her throat, forcing the steel back into her spine. "I have to give the toast." "You're ready," I told her. She looked at me one last time, her eyes dark, with a promise that terrified and thrilled me. "Don't go far," she said. "I'm right here." She turned and walked back into the light, leaving me in the shadows, breathless, with the ghost of her kiss burning on my palm. Vivian ascended the podium steps, the spotlight turning her midnight blue gown into a column of deep water. To the room, she looked untouchable, the Ice Queen restored to her rightful elevation. But I knew better. Standing in the architectural shadow of the column, my back still cooling from the wall where she had pinned me moments ago, I watched the tremor in her hands as she gripped the lucite edges. I knew that beneath the couture armor, her heart was hammering, a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. The room fell silent. Vivian didn't ask for it. She simply waited, her gaze sweeping over the billionaires and the critics, the collectors and the vultures, daring them to speak. When the silence was absolute, a heavy vacuum she had created, her eyes found mine. Across 50 feet of crowded gallery space, through the haze of expensive perfume and ambition, she locked onto me. The connection was physical, a tether pulling tight in the center of my chest, ignoring the laws of physics. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. "Tonight," she began, her voice amplified, rich and steady, reverberating off the polished concrete floors, "we celebrate the retrospective. We look back at the history of form, of color, of movement. But a retrospective is not merely an accounting of what has been. It is a declaration of what remains." She paused, letting the words settle. She wasn't reading from the prepared cards on the podium. She was speaking directly to the darkness at the back of the room. "In our industry, we obsess over provenance," she continued, her voice dropping an octave, intimate and commanding. "We demand to know the history of ownership. We trace the chain of custody. We believe that the value of a thing is determined by who has held it, who has claimed it." She leaned forward slightly, the light catching the sharp angle of her cheekbone. "But I have come to understand that the true value of art and of life is not in who owned it before. It is in who refuses to let it go." I felt the air leave my lungs. Camila was somewhere in that room, swirling her champagne and straightening her emerald jacket, but she had ceased to exist. Vivian was dismantling the threat publicly, using the precise, clinical language of her trade to stake a claim that had nothing to do with canvas and everything to do with us. "We build galleries to protect these things," Vivian said, her fingers tightening on the podium until the knuckles turned white. "We build walls. We control the temperature. We eliminate the noise. We convince ourselves that preservation requires isolation, that to keep something safe, we must keep it untouched." A murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of approval for what they assumed was a speech about conservation techniques. I knew better. I knew she was talking about the architecture of her own heart. "But I have learned," she said, her voice cracking imperceptibly, a flaw in the diamond, "that preservation is not love. Love is the risk of exposure. It is the willingness to let the light in, even if it damages the pigment. It is standing in the center of the noise and finding the one frequency that matters." She raised her glass, her hand steady now. "To the permanent collection, to the things we cannot bear to lose." "To the permanent collection," the crowd echoed, a wave of sound that washed over me. I didn't raise my glass. I raised my hands, clapping slowly, steadily. The applause swelled around me, thunderous and polite, but I was clapping for the woman who had just stripped herself bare in front of 300 people who thought she was talking about oil paint. Vivian stepped down from the podium. The donors surged forward, a tide of black tuxedos eager to bask in her light, to offer their congratulations and their checkbooks. But Vivian didn't stop. She moved through them like a ship cutting through ice. She ignored the outstretched hand of a board member. She bypassed the chief critic from the Times. She walked in a straight line, dissecting the room, bisecting the crowd, until she stood directly in front of me. The circle of privacy we created was instant and impenetrable. The noise of the party faded into white noise. She looked exhausted, exhilarating, and terrifyingly open. "Good speech," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat tight. "I meant every word," she replied. She reached out, taking the empty champagne glass from my hand and setting it on a passing tray without breaking eye contact. It was a gesture of ownership, of care. "I'm done with the silence. It's too quiet without you." "I'm not leaving, Vivian. I told you. I'm right here." "I know," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting in a ghost of a smile. "But I needed to make sure everyone else knew too. Especially you." The gallery emptied slowly, the tide of black tie receding until only the staff and the silence remained. But it wasn't the cold, sterile silence of before. It was warm, lived in. We stood amidst the scattered glasses and half-empty bottles. Vivian finally let her shoulders drop, the steel spine dissolving. She stepped in, resting her forehead against my shoulder, a surrender of gravity. "Stay," she breathed. "I am," I promised. If this story resonated with the quiet pull you feel, subscribe for more.